And that is why Sarajevo, they called it the European Jerusalem, because it's the only city in Europe where three religions could coexistently live in harmony.
It was literally medieval Barbary. It was like the whole of the Balkans, the whole of Bosnia was transported back in time to the 16th, 15th century.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for coming to the program.
Alaikum, pleasure as always.
Thank you very much. So for people who don't know, Journal Harris or Harris Stories on Instagram. So welcome to the program. I would recommend anybody who does not know his channel to definitely go. It will be in the link in the bio. So please do check his channel and watch his videos. It's amazing. So Harris, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I guess we can start with me as a kid. So I was, as they say, there's a famous quote by Ibn Battuta. It's traveling, it leaves you speechless, and then it turns you into a storyteller. And I guess that has really been the best quote that I've really resonated with over the past couple of years. Before that, I started making videos like 7 years ago. In this very room, you can even see the background is like that little, when you have the soundproof panels for gaming and things like that. Even the gaming headset, like you probably think this guy's a gamer, what's going on? So I used to game a lot 7 years ago. That's what I used to start, I started as making these trolling videos in Call of Duty. But over time, alhamdulillah, as I matured and as I began to learn more about my deen, more about traveling, more about history, I was always interested in history. My parents, they took me on many trips when I was younger to Egypt, to even Masjid al-Aqsa, Jerusalem. And I got to experience this at a very young age. And so that over time influenced me to delve into the realm of history making. People always ask me, like, how on earth did you get from making YouTube videos on Call of Duty and gaming to eventually traveling? And I guess this is the story, as you mature and as you learn a little bit about yourself, you start to develop interests. And I wouldn't say I'm a nerd at history. People assume I'm a nerd at history. I have a degree, alhamdulillah. I studied history for a good 6-7 years. But I think me...
So what did you major exactly in? History? History of what exactly?
So just history.
No,
I did a few politics courses, international relations. So, that's my field basically. But I like to take a different look at history, which is quite different to what I've seen online, what I've seen in person. And that is the root in history isn't just a subject of books, of studying, of, reading. It's not a boring subject. It's a subject you can actually physically see with your eyes. You can speak with the people that were involved in history, within modern history, within those confines. So really, that's what my work focuses on, to see traveling and history as a joint project, not something that's separable, something that's inseparable, actually. And so I guess that's my focus on my Instagram, as well as my documentaries on my long form YouTube channel.
So your documentaries, journals, I would say, could it be a little bit about learning about different cultures, like, let's say, anthropology included to an extent, or not?
To be honest, I've always been interested in different cultures and things, but I guess my main focus is history. Of course, what I like to do in my documentaries is to also show the life of the people, not just the history, not just the bloody, genocides and violence. I like to show both sides so as to not literally completely, not bore the audience, but like basically shock them with horrific facts and hard-hitting histories. I like to show that little bit of the informal side. And I think you can see that on my Instagram, actually.
Not just your Instagram, even your background. I see Bosnian flag, Iraqi flag, and I also saw Kosovo flag just before this call. Yeah, so I don't know. Were there 3 or were there 4?
Say again?
Were there 3 flags or were there 4 flags?
There were 4 flags. So I have Iraq, Palestine, Sanjak flag, which is my recent report, and then Bosnia, of course. I think Iraq is on there as well. So usually when I go on my reports, I don't like to take back the flag. I feel like it's something that's too super cliche, like to have a flag on your wall. But these countries have all impacted me. They've resonated with me. They've left me essentially speechless. I have, as I started with the quote about traveling leaves you speechless, I was just a random kid in my room with the same microphone, with the same headset, making videos about nothing. But subhanAllah, you never know what Allah can take you. There's many avenues that I could have gone down. I could have been a full-time streamer, gamer, but Allah needed me in this specific role. And for me to go through these trips, these reports, to speak with people that have survived genocides, to look at those ruined buildings that have been destroyed and bombed. I used to read about this all the time, but until you actually go to these locations, these places, and you see the people, and you see the fear in their eyes, you see everything that they've been through, you interview them, that really adds a level of depth to my personality, to me as a person. I'm still 21, and I did all of this. As funny as it sounds, I traveled to Iraq at the age, guess how old I was?
I believe you were 19 when I checked.
I was 19.
You were 19.
On my own. Bear in mind, a couple years before this, my parents wouldn't even let me leave the house on my own. Right, okay, to some extent. As Desi parents, right, they don't let you go anywhere. So I, subhanAllah, went from a kid who didn't even know how to travel outside of his city to exploring, interviewing, and making a fully fledged documentary on my own in Iraq at the age of 19. And it's so crazy, when I asked my dad, can I go to Iraq?
Wasn't, 3 years ago, there was COVID in Iraq or not really?
It was just after COVID.
Right after COVID, okay.
So, when I approached my dad to ask him permission for me to leave to Iraq, I had to do it in a very sly way. I was like, because my dad is not really clued on with his geography or his history really, until now. And I said, Dad, can I go to Mesopotamia? Without saying the word Iraq. And he's like, where's Mesopotamia? I was like, it's near Babylon, if you know what that is. All right. And then eventually I had to tell him Iraq. But, subhanAllah, he trusted me. He knew I had this vision. And I guess that passion and that vision is what has really driven me. Back then, I had no subscribers, I had no followers, nothing. But I really had that passion. And that was what was motivating me. Like, there can be nothing else that motivated me. Not the numbers, not the likes, because I didn't get anything.
It's like, it's more about the adventure. What are you learning?
Exactly. Absolutely. And so I'm very much thankful for all of these flags and Allah's permission in enabling me to see them countries, not just travel and shoot a couple of videos. I got to see Iraq that I don't think not many people would get to see. I got to see the buildings. I got to work with UNESCO.
I got to hear stories from people as well.
Exactly. And I don't feel like I could do that if I was just simply a tourist or a traveler. So people always think I'm a traveler, but I'm not. I think I have, I guess we're all travelers. We're all on this earth. We're all temporary. As Rasulullah said to the nearest meeting, live in this world like a traveler. So I guess that's what I am. I'm somebody that really wants to go to these places that nobody would want to go to, and to take their accounts, take their stories, and present it to the world. Give a platform to those voiceless people.
Definitely. It's a beautiful work. So what motivated you into this journey particularly?
So as I mentioned, I was doing history. I was studying history on my own. And of course, I had a channel where I would delve into politics a little bit sometimes. But really, 2020 was the year that it solidified.
So, but why Iraq particularly? Why did you want to start with Iraq? You were in UK. Mm-hmm. So what motivated you to go all the way to the beginning of humanity, let's say, the civilization, not humanity, but the beginning of civilization. So what motivated you to start from the beginning of civilization?
That's a good question. I think within me, I have this urge, and I think I've always had it as a kid, to really make sure the past is not forgotten. I really have a fear of losing things. And as a kid, you'd have toys, or you'd have a teddy bear that you really wanted to hold deep to you. And if you ever lost it, you're cooked. You'd be crying for the next 4 months. So with me, for example, I really hate when history is lost. That is my passion. That is my precious artifact, history as a subject. And I really, really hate to see when particular stories, particular people and histories are forgotten. For example, with Iraq, it's more or less forgotten. Even with Syria today, Syria is still under an oppressive regime. And, of course, we're talking about Palestine and things like that, but there's many places within the Ummah that have simply forgotten, skipped our conscience, for example, or with the Uyghurs in China. There's a lot of topics that are within our periphery. It's like we know that it happened, but we don't really know how it happened. And with Iraq, it's one of them. It's seen as a taboo. For example, I can't go to America now because I was banned because I went to Iraq and it was under the red list.
Okay. So now you're you're forbidden to enter the US.
I think for about 10 years until I I pay for a very, very expensive visa.
Although you have a British passport, you're banned from the US. Okay, that's I think like usually people have power when they have their European or like that's what illusion is, but seems like there's a lot of control. Okay, that's interesting.
Especially after like the Shamima Begin case and all this stuff. So is this going to Iraq is like out of bounds, especially when I went. I think it's a little bit more tourist friendly now. You see a lot of solo travelers going there now. But when I went, it was really, off the tracks. It was backwaters. So I liked that. I liked because it was backwaters, because it wasn't talked about, because nobody went there. It was like this exclusive relationship with this country. So I alhamdulillah, whenever I think of a country that I want to go to, I never not go to that country, if that makes sense. If I'm planning a trip to Bosnia, I'm going to go to Bosnia. Allah is going to give me the permission. Like I have this strong desire to go wherever my heart takes me. And there's not a single place that I want to go to that I feel like I will never go. I will never get the chance. Because people, I always say this, when us lot, as Muslims living in the West, when we want to go on holiday to somewhere, it's either Ibiza, it's either Spain, it's either Orla Deniz in Turkey, Fethiye, for example. It's never anywhere interesting. Even though it doesn't even cost more. In fact, it costs less to travel to places like Bosnia, to travel to places like Kosovo. Like you're seeing history, you're seeing nations that have skipped existential crises, have skipped being exterminated, being extinct. Bosnia, for example, was so close to being what Andalusia and Spain is today. Completely nothing. Just walking past the ruins and remnants of former giants, basically. And Bosnia was really close to being like that. And to go to these countries, to see how their spirit has been uplifted, to see how their resilience, their forbearance within the face of literal, existential extermination, to see all of that. Of course, Bosnia is beautiful.
It gives you chills, definitely gives you chills.
It makes you appreciative of the safety you have. It makes you appreciative of having Iman, having Islam, and being able to live and practice with that Iman. Because once you see these places, you start to understand, we really take Islam for granted. We really take the security, the safety for granted. And not to go on a tangent, but for the Bosnians, they never imagined they would go through what they went through. It was literally medieval Barbary. It was like the whole of the Balkans, the whole of Bosnia was transported back in time to the 16th, 15th century. You had people being, impaled. You had people with crosses skinned onto their foreheads. You had horrible, horrible crimes that you can only imagine were part of something of a bygone era, but they were actually happening 30 years ago within our lifetime.
That's actually gut-wrenching. But before I venture into Bosnia, I think I want to start with a little bit about your trips. So you've been to Bosnia, Iraq. I mean, first let's start with your first trip, which was Iraq, then Bosnia, I believe?
First trip was actually Bosnia, and it was actually by chance.
Okay. So Bosnia, Iraq, what else?
Kosovo. Palestine, I did a few reports in Jerusalem, in the West Bank as well. Hungary, and there's another one. I can't remember. Berlin.
Germany.
Yeah. Germany.
Kind of bit. Okay. So far, I know each...
And Iceland. I completely forgot. Iceland was actually my first one. Iceland was my first report.
Iceland was your first one, okay. Yeah. So far, from these journeys, I know each individual has their own gems to be discovered. Yeah. Which one is your memorable one?
Thank God you didn't say which was your favorite. I get that question all the time, and I never know how to answer. It's actually a paradoxical question. How can you compare a nation like Iraq with Iceland or Germany? It doesn't make sense. I think memorable is a great way to put it, because as people probably expect, it would be Iraq, it would be Kosovo, for example, or Bosnia, because these are big nations with a lot of histories, a lot of things to see. Recently, I feel like this question changes from time to time. Right now, because I always say when you return from a journey, that is when the real trip begins, because you begin to internalize everything. All the memories become from short term to long term. So me, for example, when I went to Bosnia, I didn't think much of it until I arrived home. Same with Iraq, same with many of the nations. I've just been in Sanjak, this nation, this historic nation, which was part of Bosnia. A lot of Muslims there. And I'm starting to now process it now that I'm back home in UK. So for me right now, the trip that I'm reminiscing on the most, and that is leaving me with the most memories and things to look back on, is Hungary, out of all countries.
Hungary, okay, interesting. Why?
Because that trip was, honestly, I was there for like 5-6 days. It wasn't even 2 months or like a month, 10 days. It was literally 5 days. But on that trip, I felt because obviously I went on that trip to report on the lost Islamic heritage there. You got to bear in mind, this is the most furthest northern outpost of the Ottomans, of any Khilafat in history. This is the height, the pinnacle. And as you journey in Hungary, as I journey across the whole country, I think I went to like 8 cities in 5 days or something. And I crossed 2 countries, and I was on the move all the time. And I felt like I was in the footsteps of those very same soldiers that were marching in to Hungary, that were embedding Islam within this region. And to see mosques, to see the most northern minaret of the Muslim world in Hungary, that really adds a level of sadness as well as something to be proud of, that Islam has reached as further as Hungary. And then you're brought back to the present day, from being at the height, the gates of Vienna, to being bombed in our own homes in Gaza, for example. That is something that really touched me more than I think any other trip. To walk on lands, by the way, I'm pretty sure, 100%, that I was the only person in Hungary there, not to see Hungary, but to see the Islamic past. Because it's something that people want to forget. They label it with the occupation and the colonialism, something I think we can discuss actually later on. And I was the only person there trying to find the traces of these Ottomans, of these Muslims, going to the mosques that people have forgotten, the mosques that were converted into churches. It felt like I was there for responsibility.
So what are your goals? Like, why do you do this documentary? You said one of the reasons is to teach people, to inform people. Anything else that you have? What is the purpose of recording other than informing people or the future generation?
Absolutely. I'm going to sound very selfish here, for myself, actually. I'm a similar human as somebody that would consume content online. I'm starting to wane off that now because obviously I don't have time. But I'm a person that, I'm just a normal guy. I aspire to learn as much as I can. And going on these trips, of course, is beneficial for the audience, for the generations to come. But as a person who lived a normal, very lackluster, mundane life, you know what life is like in Europe, man. Eat, sleep, repeat, and then, maybe something new happens every once now and then. Even with COVID, for example, COVID was a relief for some of us because it was a break from normality. And I guess these reports, these trips in these countries are a great way of me detaching myself from this rat race, this dunya basically, and to really learn about myself, learn about other people, meet people. People in England think I'm an introvert, which maybe I am. But as soon as I step foot in another country, I become this extroverted man who's on a hunt, on a mission. I would do things in Hungary, in Bosnia, for example, that I would never even imagine of doing here, like approaching people and asking them questions. I could never do that in England. But somehow, whenever I go abroad, I really, I want to maximize the benefit, not just for you guys watching at home, but for myself. I get to learn a lot about myself. And as I started with that quote about traveling makes you a storyteller, it made me a storyteller. I would just be another average dude with nothing going for me. But now, alhamdulillah, I'm able to have these stories for myself. When I'm about to sleep at 3 a.m., I think about that one time in Bosnia where some guy treated me out for a dinner, or one time in Iraq when I was in a completely desolate environment and this little kid said Assalamu alaikum to me and he hugged me and things like that. I look back on those moments just before I sleep every day. Like, it's something you can't take out of your mind. It's ingrained within my mind. So I guess I do it for other people as well as myself, to learn about my own deen. And I can't stress enough how...
Have you ever hitchhiked in any of these places?
Oh, yeah.
A lot.
Sometimes it's the
first time your parents should be like, oh, you're 19 and you're hitchhiking.
Parents should not be watching this, actually.
Okay, I know that situation.
Yeah. And this is how you travel. Because sometimes you'd have to go to a village that is so desolate. For example, in the Sanjak, in the Balkans, this city, small city, on the coast, on the border, of Bosnia and Serbia, sandwiched between these two, almost like an exclave. And there's no Wi-Fi, there's no signal, there's no network, there's nobody there, except for like 2 old people in the middle of nowhere. And you have to drive like an hour and a half just to get to this village. And I tried my best for 3 weeks to get to this city, because nobody's there. And in this city, in this town, it's not even a town. Like, you have a house, and then 20 minutes down the road, you drive and there's another house. And there you go, there's a village. That's what they call a village. And in this town, there was a terrible ethnic cleansing campaign against Muslims. Can you imagine? In the middle of nowhere, these ultra-nationalist Serbs wanted to literally uproot the the Muslims from this small little town. They were massacred, they were genocided, they were brutally...
So for the audience a little bit, can you start with like how did Bosnia accepted Islam? How did Bosnians become Muslim? Like they're Slavs, and Slavic people come from the north, like let's say Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Slovenia, Slovakia. So these are basically Slavs from the north. How did they come to the south, and how did they accept Islam? And what is the beef between Serbs and the Bosniak Muslims?
Oh man, that's going to be a right roller coaster to explain that. But let's start with the beginning. Some people, and most, you see this online actually, especially in my posts, people will say these Bosniaks, they're not actually Bosniaks, they're Serbs that converted into Islam, or they say that they were forcefully converted and they should be re-reverted back to Christianity, for example. It's actually really, really interesting. The history of it actually disproves everything. It goes to show, like, picking up one book or reading one article on this matter can literally dispel every single one of their myths. That is how lazy their attempts to discredit the credibility of these Muslims that have been Muslim for almost 600, 700 years. Almost as long as Christianity has been in Europe, for the Slavic nations for. So Islam first originated in Bosnia with Arab traders in the 7th century. So it's been implanted ever since almost the time of the Sahaba, for example. And over time, there's something interesting to learn about the Bosnians is that they have their own church. So they were sandwiched in the middle of Orthodoxy and Catholicism. So you have Orthodoxy in the east, Catholicism in the west, of course, with the Holy Roman Empire, for example, the Western Roman Empire. And of course, the east is influenced by the Byzantine Empire. So they're Orthodox Christians. So Bosnia actually found itself, if you look at a map, Bosnia finds itself in the middle, slap bang, in the crossroads of those two diverging sects of Christianity. So they were oppressed by both of them. The Bosnian church, they were oppressed by both of them. They were called heretics. They were called as disbelievers, for example. So they had their own church. And this church originated, really interesting this, they originated from the Bogomils. And the Bogomils, they were descended from, after the Nicene Creed, and after they were essentially, all the Christians were brought together and they were there to discuss what is the history of Jesus. Was he Son of God? Was he God? Or was he the Holy Spirit?
Of Jesus, yeah.
Exactly. What is the nature of Jesus? And so in that creed, in that gathering, they concluded that he was the Son of God, for example. And every other person that said otherwise, they were banished. They were banished and exiled. And one of these guys, I believe his name was Arian, he moved to the Balkans, the southern Slavic nations, and he began his own strand of Christianity that believed Jesus wasn't entirely the Son of God, or he wasn't divine in that matter. So the Bosnians originated from this man and his teachings, or one of his disciples' teachings. He had, I think, 12 people that were with him, and one of his 12 disciples moved to the Balkans.
It makes sense as well, because Yugoslavia, the former, Czech Republic and all that region, they had Orthodox Christians, they had Roman Catholic Christians, and that's what they had so many conflicts, and now it's divided. Now you don't have in Yugoslavia, so it makes sense that you had other minority groups of Christianity there in that particular region. Absolutely,
yeah. So the Bosnian church then had something really interesting that is almost, some of their practices were almost parallel with teachings in Islam. They prayed 5 times a day. Hear this out, praying 5 times a day. They would do sajda as Muslims would do. They would actually, in some of the churches that they found, you can still see them today, their niche, their qibla, was actually towards the direction of Mecca. Of course, it's probably Jerusalem, but the fact that they specifically prayed towards the direction of Bilad al-Sham, very interesting. They would also fast. They would also believe, some of them, I think majority of them would believe that Jesus wasn't divine and that he wasn't just a prophet like many other prophets before them. So the teachings were there. Everything was ripe for them to accept Islam when Islam originally was brought in and introduced with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, for example.
These people found Islam way more appealing than the rivalries of Christianity, for example. They were called heretics. They were persecuted for their religion. These are Christians being persecuted by Christians. So when the Muslims came, the Ottomans actually had a policy of religious tolerance. You could practice your religion to some extent freely, and it was way more revolutionary than any of the empires at the time. In Europe, for example, they were beheading heretics, they were beheading Protestants and Catholics and whatnot. And in Muslim Europe, in the Balkans, the Ottomans said, look, you can practice in your own churches. Of course, the main churches that are, poignant, for example, we're going to convert into mosques. But if you want, you can live however you like in your churches, and you can go to Bosnia today and you find a synagogue, a Jewish synagogue. Bear in mind, in the Balkans, there's no Jews, there's no synagogues before the Ottomans, but they brought them there. They welcomed them because they were persecuted in Spain. In the 1490s, they were persecuted. And so the Ottomans brought these Jews into Sarajevo, the capital city of Bosnia today. And they said, you have free range to live however you want. And actually, they gave them land, for example, and they could do whatever they want. And so they built a synagogue. So the Muslims were building, and not building, of course, I don't think that's allowed. Allowing people to live. And that is why Sarajevo, a city in Bosnia, this Muslim city, they called it the European Jerusalem, because it's the only city in Europe where three religions could coexistently live in harmony. So this was the Ottoman and Muslim rule in Europe. The Muslims accepted Islam because they could be brothers with somebody in Egypt. They could be brothers with somebody in Mecca, for example, because that was under Ottoman rule. So they liked the idea of unity. And so that is how Islam was introduced to Muslims in the Balkans. And of course, to some extent, some of them accepted Islam for the societal benefits, but many accepted Islam because it was way more appealing, like I mentioned, to the rivalries and the barbarity of the Christians around them.
Okay. Interesting. So, when did this genocide start? Like, about what time did the genocide start?
I'm curious. I'm curious to know, when do you think it started?
Well, I would say World War I, perhaps, or like the fall of Yugoslavia.
Yeah, you're close. I do have to correct you. I hate to be the history nerd, but it's Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia. Okay. I don't know if you might call it differently, actually.
Yugoslavia or something like that, yeah?
So Yugoslavia is the collective federation of those Balkan countries, yeah. So it actually began, you're very close, World War II, yeah, but it's actually the end of the Ottomans. So the Ottoman decline actually began as early as the late 1600s. So that is when you have the Crusades, essentially, against the Ottomans and the Muslims in Europe. Usually you expect crusades to be in Jerusalem, but you had many, many failed crusades and also successful crusades against the Ottomans in Europe. So you have the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they're pushing the Ottomans out of these places that they have been there for 500 years. And I also wanted to mention a thing to dispel some of the rumors. People think that Islam was something that was new to Europe. Actually, if you look at it, in some regions in Europe, Islam has been there way longer than Christianity has actually been there.
True, because
Christianity,
because Christianity, towards Poland and Czech Republic, they accepted Christianity towards 12th century, and Islam was already in Andalusia until the 12th century. So in like you said, in some of these places, Islam predates Christianity in some of these lands. But yeah,
absolutely, yeah. So I guess that's one of the things. I've lost my train of thought now. What was I talking about?
You were talking about how Islam.
So at the end of the 1600s, you have the Great Turkish War, and that was where the Ottoman Empire really declined from. And you have now these Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarians, uprooting Muslims, completely erasing any evidence as they're steamrolling their way ahead to Constantinople. Even the Russians were helping them. In 1878, you have the Turkish-Ottoman War, where the Turks are fueling nationalism within the Balkans, telling these people, look, do you really want these bloody Muslims to be ruling you? Get them out of your country, for example. Even though they lived coexistently, Christians used to call themselves Ottomans. That's why people actually debate whether the Ottoman Empire was actually an empire. Because in some regions, you have people that were, they were made the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. Christians, people that were classed as slaves, they had a chance to be the viziers of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, you have elements of, whoever you want to call it, oppression towards the end of the Ottoman days. That's because the nation is contracting. Whenever a nation contracts, you have violence that follows through. So that's why you had the Armenian, whatever you want to call it, genocide or massacre, depending on what you think. And so as the Ottomans are leaving the Balkans, as they're being kicked out, and these are not just Ottomans, these are ethnic people that have lived there for centuries. That is all they have known, and that are their ancestors, basically. They're their ancestral homeland.
Basically, the converts or people who moved in. I mean, it can be both in any case, yeah.
And even the Bosniaks, they've been in Europe for thousands of years, almost thousands of years, even before Christianity. Mm-hmm. So you're now rerouting, and they estimate 5 million Muslims were killed, 5 million Muslims were expelled just from the 1800s to the 1920s. Just in that short span of time, so much of the history of the people, the memories, the lives, completely uprooted, completely exterminated, extinguished from history books, from common memory, living memory, for example. All of that completely rerouted, and that is something that I want to focus on, to really find them traces, them remnants, because we see Bosnia as this Muslim nation of many Muslims in history. Actually, you have hundreds of these examples across the Balkans. In Greece, for example, Athens, you had mosques everywhere. In Belgrade, you had 300 mosques around Belgrade in the city itself. And it was 95% majority Muslim. Guess how many Muslims there are today?
Hardly 3%.
Yeah. A couple thousand, maybe.
Yeah.
So you went from the whole nation being filled with mosques and examples of Muslims that lived there hundreds of years to completely all of that just expelled. As the Ottomans are reaching, as the Ottomans are fleeting. Belgrade is the capital city of Serbia, and I traveled there recently because I had to go get a flight in Belgrade, and it's like you're traveling in the West Bank or places within Palestine that were ethnically cleansed. Exact same feeling, or even the exact same feeling as being in Spain. So we like to look at the Spanish history and the exodus of the Muslims there. In the Balkans, it's rife with these examples. Spain is just one small example. In the Balkans, you have way more examples, way more cities, way more countries that were completely uprooted. So the genocide against Muslims, ethnic Muslims, you can call them Bosniaks. There's a loose term. They call any Muslim within that Slavic region as Bosniaks. So you have Bosniaks in Montenegro, Bosniaks in Serbia, for example. You have Bosniaks across the Balkans. And so the genocide against the Bosniaks have been a process, a plan from these so-called Christians, these nationalists, ultra-nationalists, since the early 1600s. And the most recent example of that was the 1990s. So the 1990s isn't an anomaly. People treat it as, oh, it's such a terrible thing that happened to Bosnians. Actually, no. They say every 50 years, there's a genocide against the Bosniaks in Bosnia and across the peninsula. So the 1990s is just one example of many, many, many attempts of continuously trying to uproot these people and exterminate Islam from Europe.
So when you say 50 years, I think something is brewing in that region again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it again the same?
Just rife with violence and nationalism. It's a super messy place. I like to use this term. It's called quantum Balkan theory. To understand really the Balkans, you have to have like some next level PhD. Because even after studying it for so long, even still there are some things I'm like, how does that make any sense? How does Serbia supporting Palestinians make any sense? These are the guys who genocided the Muslims, but they do Serbian support to some extent Palestine. Because you've got to understand, because anything, this is going to go into another rabbit hole, but anything against the Americans, the Serbs will support. So they'll support Palestinians, even if they don't agree with them, as long as it's going against the Americans, because they don't like America, because America bombed them in 1999. So as you can see, it's such a mess. It is a complete mess, the Balkans. And as you mentioned, the tensions are brewing up in Kosovo, and 50 years before 1990s was World War II. That is when you had the last genocide against the Muslims. 50 years before that was World War I. 50 years before that was the 1870s, for example. So we're on schedule for another genocide. And I think, just to butt in 1 second, I think one thing that's really important to know about the next tensions that we're going to see, and hopefully we don't, inshallah, hopefully something will happen that will calm down the tensions, because really these people have gone through so much within our lifetime. The parents have gone through so much, and it's had a huge impact on everything in the Balkans, the economy, the society.
How does communism come into play in that region?
Right.
And
yeah.
When does it come into play, by the way?
I think this is leading into actually what I was going to talk about. So communism was introduced in the 1940s. So in the 1940s, after World War II, everybody is sort of in turmoil. The disparity is huge. People just rolling banks of like coins to buy something. Inflation is high. And so naturally people would turn towards communism as this as this way to quench their thirst of something. They want development, they want industry, they want a job, for example. So it was a radical form of ideology that was present in Europe already with the Russians in 1917. But they thought, why not? Let's try it. So all across Eastern Europe, you have communists in Hungary and Bulgaria, for example. And so communism naturally was brought to the Balkans and Bosnia and the surrounding regions in the 1940s. So you had in the 1940s, the Germans came and occupied Yugoslavia. there was a civil war between the Muslims. Not the Muslims. I don't even think you can call this a civil war. It was a genocide against the Muslims. The Croatians, who were aligned with the Germans, were killing Serbians. So it was a huge mess. So people turned towards.
So Croatians are in conflict with Serbs.
Yeah.
Muslims are in conflict with Serbs. Mm-hmm. And what happens with the coalition between Croatians and Muslims? Are there any
yeah, so it began. So the you could say the Croatians to some extent worked with the Muslims during World War II. They mm-hmm. had friendly relationships because actually the whole of Bosnia, if you look at a map of Bosnia in World War II, it's simply not there because it was handed over to the Croatians because they were fascists. They were called Ustaša. So because they aligned with Germany during World War II, they were given like whatever they wanted and they were given territory. And so I want to ask you a question. Why do you think the Croatians who are Catholic don't like the Serbians? Why do you think they don't have friendly relations? Why do you think they're literally at each other's necks?
I don't exactly remember, but one of them use Orthodox Christianity and one of them is Roman Christian, and they use different. One is Cyrillic alphabets, and one uses Latin alphabet, I believe. So there is a tension. Yeah.
Yeah. Because obviously that one's Catholic and one's Orthodox. So you've had this historic rivalry for so long that predated the World War II and the Yugoslav wars, for example. So the Croatians in World War II literally just genocide the Serbs. Like 1 million Serbs or something like that were just genocided because they were put in concentration camps. And then you had the Serbs also attacking the Muslims, having this idea of creating this greater Serbian state.
So why Serbians were attacking Muslims rather than aligning with the Muslims against Croatia?
There you go. It makes no sense. Mm-hmm. They have that hatred for Islam could not allow them to work coincidentally. Some did, but for vast majority, they wanted to exterminate these people.
What about Croatians towards Muslims? Like, were they also antagonistic towards Muslims, or they were
not as bad as Serbians or the Orthodox, for example? Because the Croatians weren't really under Ottoman rule for very long, or at least they weren't under occupation, if you can call it that. So they've had this weird relationship where they deem the Bosniaks as Croatians that converted to Islam, which is completely not true. Bosniaks have their own identity, their own ethnicity. Mm-hmm. So they had this idea in World War II that if we can become friendly with these Muslims, maybe they'll convert back to Catholicism or something stupid like that. Okay. So in World War II, as you have these three diverging factions, actually the Muslims found themselves at the center of all of this, as they have done in many, many times. The Bosniak Muslims were cornered from all sides in the 1990s as well. The World War II and the 1990s were so similar. It's as if the 1990s, they looked at the history books and so how can we kill these guys? All right, we did it before, we could do it again. Because you've got to remember, 1990s and 1945, it's not very long of a period. Yeah. So you have the Croatians killing the Serbians killing the Muslims. And then you had the Yugoslav partisans, these communists that wanted to liberate Yugoslavia for everybody. So they really were not inclined towards nationalism. So you had many, even Muslims actually fought with the partisans, the communists.
So what you're saying is communism came into, or like, are we talking about the USSR ruling that region or not really?
No, they just accepted communism. So like I said, communism was rife in this period because it was seen as like this, the ideology of the liberators of the partisans. So
it was not connected by land, but by ideology with the USSR.
By ideology, yeah. Okay. And actually, they hated the USSR because they saw them once again as occupators because they occupied half Europe. So the Yugoslavia was actually really a strange anomaly because it wasn't aligned with either the USSR or the West. It was its own thing. Okay. So these communists, of course, with help from both, they received any help that they could have. They milked their connections for all they were worth, and they liberated Yugoslavia. So they defeated all the Chetniks and the Ustaša and the ultranationalists. They put Yugoslavia under their thumb, basically. And so after 1945, you have communism in Yugoslavia. A man by the name of Tito, he's the leader of these communists. He decides that no more nationalism, because we've just been killing each other for the past 4 years. No more nationalism. We're going to have an idea of brotherhood and unity. If anybody waves a flag or says their nation is better than another nation, they're like put in prison without a doubt, with no question. They are no trial.
That's where religious suppression also comes into play, right?
There you go. Yeah.
Okay, so that's why we can say Albania, Kosovo, to an extent, is more secular, or has tendencies to be more secular than Muslim.
Absolutely. And it's one of the reasons why I hate when people go to Bosnia. And they go, hang on, why are these guys not got beards? Why are they, some of them in bars, for example? Or why do they not all wear hijabs, for example? You can't judge these people. Of course, those things are intrinsic with Islamic values, but these people have, you got to understand, they've been under communism for 45 years. And this is restrictive communism. This is, you have to be part of the Communist Party for you to work at a random job. Anybody that worked had to be part of the Communist Party. Mosques were left open, but if you were prayed in there, you were blacklisted. And you have many ulama that were just killed. For example, in a city in Serbia, which then became part of communist Yugoslavia, called Novi Pazar. After 1945, as these communist partisans are making their way into the city, liberating it, they would kill somewhere up to like 2,000 ulama and politicians and influential Muslims. So you have a lot of restrictions. But this was their way of making sure that the World War II would not happen again. Essentially, the tensions of World War II would not happen again. So, for the next 45 years, there were no genocides, there was no large-scale violence and events like World War II, for example. So it wasn't necessarily bad in the sense of the economy and stability. It was good in them senses, but in terms of religion, it was very oppressive and suppressive. So that is one of the reasons why during the communist times you have a lot of people not leaving Islam but becoming more secular. And I always like to say, the 1990s happened, and linking back to the modern day, the 1990s happened, all these tensions. The Croatians, for example, they, if we get onto the history of Yugoslav war, the Serbians wanted to create a greater Serbian state. So they invaded Croatia, they invaded Slovenia, they invaded Bosnia and Kosovo. So if you have all of this nationalism that we see in the 1990s, the Croatians actually adopting the same fascist flag that was there in World War II, and the Serbs adopting that same ideology of wiping out the Muslims. If you have all of that nationalism in the 1990s, after 45 years of communism restricting this nationalism, imagine what the next genocide will be like. Because now you have no restrictions. There's no communism. You can wave a flag. You can wave a Chetnik flag, which is the flag of the Serbs. You can wave a flag, a fascist flag of the Croatians. You can do all of this. You can actually paint a mural celebrating a war criminal, which we see across Bosnia, in the Serb regions of Bosnia. They celebrate war criminals. You can do all of that. So it's literally unchecked, this nationalism. Very, very dangerous. So if the 1990s was as bad as we saw it, imagine what the next genocide will be like.
Especially with the weapons and I think after that Enigma was discovered or invented. Yeah, that's, to an extent, although communism is bad, to what happened to Islam, it might have saved lives rather a little bit. Just another, kind of pushed, rather, it pushed a civil war or like a genocide in that region. How do you see the situation right now in that region, that peninsula?
Yeah, so getting along the technical side now. So Russia actually wants a Trojan horse-like event in the Balkans, if you can see what I mean. So
they're collaborating with Serbs, I believe.
Yeah. The relations are really, really strong at this given moment because Putin is struggling. The guy he's flopping in Ukraine. They were supposed to take Kiev in like a week or something, and bro's still at the gates of Kiev. They're nowhere near, actually. So they're really struggling in Ukraine because of NATO support. NATO's pumping in everything to Ukraine and the resistance, or whatever you want to call it. However, Putin then wants a distraction. So he wants NATO to be distracted in the Balkans with another Balkan war. So he's basically using Bosnia and the Muslims and the Serbs as a chessboard, basically. So he's going to fuel up tensions in the Balkans because the tensions are already there. They're very rife, and all it needs is just one thing, and it out of proportion. So he's really egging on and showing support to the Serbs as a way of saying, you know what, you can invade Kosovo, or you can take the Serb regions in Bosnia. You can do that, and tensions are literally looking like that today. Like there were tensions on the border, for example, very reminiscent of the 1990s. So if NATO is distracted then in Kosovo, in the Balkans, it allows Putin to sweep up the territory in Ukraine, for example. So he's doing all of this at the expense of thousands of lives in the former Yugoslavia.
A lot to unpack for sure.
It is. Like I said, this is quantum Balkan theory. I'm just blurting out any information I have. So it's I can imagine for the reader and for the audience being like completely amazed and also like overloaded with this information, because it's very rarely discussed. We'd like to talk about the Middle East, but this is a region that's very close to us as well as Muslims.
And what about migration? What is the population of Bosnia?
It's, I think, a couple million. I believe it's 4 million.
4 million. And do you think what is the percentage of Muslims there?
Muslims are around 41%. Either 41% or the percentages change every now and then, but they are majority. The majority population of Bosnia is Muslims. Then you have 33% Croatians. Then you have 33% Serbs. So it's not just Muslims.
We're talking about Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? That region. All right. I think let's. I mean, it's a very long conversation. I don't want to get into different stories. You don't want to, maybe exactly. We'll split it in parts.
You can edit things. Like I said, you gotta keep me on track, because sometimes I have a habit of taking. No.
I mean, I think we'll have another part. But I do want to venture into different stories, but another time. So far, what lessons have you learned in your trips? Like, maybe let's just stick with Bosnia. Mm-hmm. What lessons have you learned, and what can we learn? What can Muslims learn from that tragedy?
Absolutely. So, going back to, it's my first day in Bosnia. I'm a kid, 19-year-old, still discovering the world, discovering myself, and I walk up to the hills of Sarajevo in the peaks as the sun is dripping like wax, as this glow, this golden tint is shining across the whole of Sarajevo, the city that experienced so much turmoil within 3 years. It was the longest siege in modern history, what the Serbs did to the Muslims in the 1990s. And to know all the history of this region that was founded by the Ottomans, and all the infamous people that walked on these lands and butchered the Muslims, and all of the great poets, all the great ulama that have traveled to this land over the past 500-600 years, to be at the top of Sarajevo, as I'm standing in the cemetery of the Shuhada of Sarajevo in the 1990s. You have approximately 2,000 graves just in that location. They say 11,000 were killed in Sarajevo during the siege, just in the siege alone in the 1990s. And as I am standing in the midst of these people who I never knew, but I can see their names, I can see how old they were when they died, 20s, 30s, young people. And as a person that lived my life doing nothing for the Ummah, giving no sacrifice, as somebody that all I thought about was, when's the next game coming out, or what's the next movie I can watch, or what's the next thing I could do? I want to go for a dessert. I want to go for a meal. Let's go with the lads, drive and as kids do, as teenagers do. And I looked at that, and I looked at what these people endured. For 3 years, their main concerns weren't this. For 3 years, their main concern was defending Islam, but defending their honor, their identity, even if they weren't Muslims, because of course you had non-Muslims fighting for the Muslims as well. And that need to defend themselves was so far beyond what their condition was. There's a mosque in Sarajevo in the peaks, and it's a mosque hidden from everything. And this was a mosque that the Muslims built during the war. Imagine, they're freezing, they're dying because of the sheer weather, the temperatures. But their main concern was to build a mosque. And so being in that particular moment, having everything just come at me all at once, the nation, the city, looking at the whole skyline, seeing the mosques resilient, strong, not standing alone, busy with musallis, to see how Bosnia went from somewhere that could have been exterminated to now today hearing the adhan. And as I was in that moment, I heard the adhan and I just began to weep, because you can't imagine how much these people have been through, how close they were from being erased. Yet here, Islam still prevails. Thousands upon thousands of miles away from Mecca, where our Prophet ﷺ initially preached Islam, 1,400 years after Islam began, or at least when Rasulullah ﷺ gave the final message. And to know that these people sacrificed their life. These people were the guardians of Islam in Europe. Imagine how far away we are. So that is something that really made me appreciate my deen, made me appreciate how big Islam really is. Because there are Muslims across the world, as far as Indonesia, as far as places like China. Muslims aren't the people that are just brown people. These are European Muslims, and they were willing to give their life for this religion, for this deen. They never saw Rasulullah. They never even spoke Arabic, for example, but they were willing to give their deen. And a lot of people like to judge and say, they didn't have beers and that and this. But when it came to the matter of it, these people were willing to give their lives. And that was something that really struck me. And I'd never seen anywhere else.
SubhanAllah. I mean, yeah, it is a lesson for us to step up and maybe do something. Especially right now, all the least people are asking is to protest and boycott and do something, and yet people are kind of. I mean, I'm not saying everybody, but some people are neglectful, or rather, they want to be in delusion rather. So
Absolutely.
it's kind of a message. I think we should be encouraging others, like with patience, of course. It's not something. I mean, it grew out right now. BDS is not a new movement, although it has caught up its wings. But it has been, I think, at least for about 15 years. At least
Mhm.
I came across BDS movement from like about 7 years ago.
Mhm.
So
So it's relatively new. Like we're still forming this front, you could say, still really understanding our identity. You could
yeah, and
say.
especially right now, I'm talking about BDS in the sense, you have the student encampment coming up. I don't know how UK is prepared, but definitely the US is prepared. I don't know about the UK audience. Like, I would encourage the UK audience to step up their game, because especially you have won. I mean, not ultimately, but like you've achieved something, like with 4 independent candidates, and like withdrawing 10% of arms embargo to Israel. That's something, at least. And I think the next move is divestment,
Yeah.
not just boycott, but also now the next step. I think first it starts with boycotting, then moves to divestment, and then eventually the government takes up and says, we sanction Israel. So I would really encourage, your words of encouragement to your audience, but first of all to the UK, but also the European audience, and eventually to the students abroad to step up their game in student encampment and go on for what do you call? Yeah, divestment.
Absolutely, 100%. Very, very spot on with what you mentioned. We're so used to the status quo and just doing the bare minimum, but we have to continuously improve and improve.
Do you have anything else that you want to add to the podcast, or do you have any message to the people or to students? Anybody?
Yeah, my message is really, as Muslims, we're so used to just living our lives, doing nothing for the greater good. We all have a little bit of passion within us. We all have ideas. Otherwise, you wouldn't be watching this podcast. You wouldn't be interested. If you manage to watch all this long, you have something in you. You have this passion within you. And I really am somebody that wants people to hone down on their passion, not just to live your life and be a consumer. Be the person that people will consume your content or your works or articles, whatever. Be somebody that is an innovator, somebody that brings something to the table. Because the more people we have like yourself, you're going out or your way to meet people and to interview people, to really collect this repository of stories and lessons. I think that's something we all should do, not just to live your life and study and be a doctor as we all are nowadays. Our parents just want us to be doctors and become robots. Don't become a robot. You have a lot
even
of
with
passion.
doctors, I was just talking on my last podcast. I was talking with another person. Even if you're a doctor, I think one of the things that we need is a union. Remember when the coal industry started, and then people literally were forced into slavery in the UK and the US? They had to form unions. Only then they could break away from their slave masters. So now we are living in we have slave masters. It's not like we don't have, like they come at us legally, or they scare us with legal terms or paperwork and stuff. So I think we have to form unions. And when you say doctors, like, I think even with doctors creating unionship, at least do that. Like, it doesn't matter if you're going to become a lawyer or a doctor or anything, but like create something within your sphere. I mean, yes, there are doctors who go out to Gaza, to other places where there's turmoil. If you're unable to go, at least do something here, like within your sphere, within the people that you know.
Absolutely. Be somebody that adds something. Like you said, that's such a noble work to be able to go to Gaza to organize something. Otherwise, we're just living like robots. And I think that's something that I really want to get out of our Muslim community. We're just so stagnant. Even imams, for example, some of them will just give a Friday lecture and that's it. We need the youth. And you guys who are watching, you are the youth. And I really believe in, the fate, especially with the protests and everything. We are the next generation. And believe in Allah, we will see in our lifetimes the liberation of Al-Aqsa, and much more, inshallah.
Ameen, inshallah. So, Jazakallah khair, Haris. Thank you very much for your contribution. And inshallah, I hope that people learn a lot of lessons from your journeys. And inshallah, they'll continue following you and learn from your lessons, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Wa alaikum assalam.